Welcome to Northwestern Masters of the Arts in Sports Administration Revenue Above Replacement podcast. I'm Brice Clinton.
And I'm Adam Grossman.
Adam, good to see you as always.
Yeah, good to see you too.
What's amazing is you and I talking and listeners hearing us means there's typically some type of special occasion or something going on. And what is wild is that we're starting the fifth season of this podcast. And, you and I were talking before we started recording. It's pretty amazing that we have made it this far is a bad way to say it, but it's cool to be able to get to this far and just looking back on it. Did you think we'd make it this far? What are sort of your thoughts on that?
I'd say, I guess I'm an analytical person, but I hadn't really thought about it. It's never episodes. I still was surprised when we had the 100th episode last season. I didn't even register that it was 100 episodes, but yeah, we've done a lot. There's a lot of interesting people to talk to, and I'm excited that we've had this many episodes so far.
Same. You're right. There always are interesting people to talk to. And one of the really cool things is it kind of snowballs on itself.
Yeah.
From interviews that either one of us do or things that we do from a teaching perspective or in our day jobs, you run into those interesting people. And typically it's not pulling people's legs really hard to be on a podcast. They like to talk and they like to promote their things. And so it's worked out great for us because of that reason. And it gives both of us a chance to talk to some really interesting people.
Yeah, I think the opportunity to talk to really interesting people. And to your point, I think there are a lot of people who want to engage with our community here in Northwestern, and as this podcast has continued to grow, folks outside of the Northwestern ecosystem. But I think the guests that we've had, the insights that those guests provide, the topics that we cover, it's been really interesting. And, you can track somewhat the evolution of the sports industry over the past 5 years across the conversations that we have been having, from, the rise of artificial intelligence or, historically, we were talking about this before, but COVID, the impact of COVID, the impact of some of the new types of partnerships from a crypto or what, some of these new technologies that emerges perspective to artificial intelligence, to some of the things we'll talk about in the upcoming season, particularly real estate, mixed use development, technology, media disruption. There's a lot of things that we've been able to talk about and track through the podcast and the interviews with the guests that we've had.
You're right. And that's one that the real estate one I think is really interesting. It's one that originally I didn't have a whole lot of interest in. I mean, I love stadiums. I love visiting stadiums. But if you step back from it and the work that you did previously last year in the paper that you wrote, there's so much that goes into those things, not only from the teams in the leagues, but the finance partners, the real estate development components of it. It's a really interesting part of sports that without this podcast, really wouldn't have uncovered much more. And it is really impactful across the sports industry.
Yeah, we're planning on having a guest who is, if not the expert, was one of the foremost experts on mixed use developments in sports coming up in a later episode of the show. So excited for everybody to learn more from him, given his expertise and experience. But yeah, I mean, I think people, this is a connection I try to make in my thought leadership pieces, but with the rise of technology, particularly artificial intelligence, there's potentially increased or parallel interest in people having in real life experiences, and sports anchors can serve as the platform for in real life experiences inside and outside of game day. Also people want to live, work, play, and shop in places where they can maximize their happiness and fun and potentially maximize these in real life experiences and mixed use developments, particularly ones that are anchored by sports venues, practice facilities, corporate headquarters, or it doesn't have to just be sports and entertainment more broadly. Like those are things that people want to do, and being able to live in the places where you can do the things that you want to do is really interesting and exciting.
It's a good segue because you actually wrote a piece about this I think it was last week, around the investment from, I think it's a Silver Lake and the sovereign wealth fund from NEA. And so the purchase of EA from investors, I think it's 55 billion. But the point that you're making, and I think is a really interesting one, is that just what you were saying is that investments like this could be a really good sign for these in real life experiences. And so why do you think that translates into those real life experiences?
Yeah, and I think the Saudi Public Investment Fund, or PIF, and Silver Lake, and a fund is called Affinity, led by Jerry Kushner. They put together the deal to take Electronic Arts from a public company to a private company, as you said, in a $55 billion transaction. And the article that I wrote about it, or the Revenue Above Replacement newsletter, was focused on, how could the world's largest, or one of the world's largest video game companies being taken private be a good sign for in real life experiences. And with the PIF and Silver Lake explicitly, they're trying to own the entire sports ecosystem. And, particularly if you're talking about Silver Lake, the main thing that they own is Endeavor, while PIF has made several investments in e-gaming, but also in real life experiences having to do with sports, a lot of which are have already come to fruition. You'll see a lot more of those coming to fruition soon in terms of tournaments and special events and soccer. So like they've already made investments, and I think they see the intersection of that being really important. So the idea, this is something that's happened before in sports and different types of media constructs, but people consuming sports in different ways, whether it's media, video games, and media has been radio, to start with, then television, then, in streaming or streaming video on demand, or, in all the different ways that the more people consume the content, the more likely they want to experience it. And typically the more likely they want to experience it in real life. We have a case study in the book that I co-authored called The Sports Strategist, which highlights that from the UFC in terms of the Ultimate Fighter, and the Ultimate Fighter becoming the entryway for people to start learning about UFC, and then UFC parlayed that into a really important and vital in real life, in venue, live event and premium live event experience, where people were paying top dollar to come to UFC events because of a media and way in ensuring a consumption strategy. And from my perspective, that's one of the reasons that so much money went into this strategy, is these companies already have made substantial investments into sports and into sports experiences, and using video games to catalyze a sports experience is really important.
You just see that with two on Netflix, Drive to Survive with F1. It's such an experience that drove people to Formula One. Formula One, you know, I had the opportunity to live in Europe for quite a while, and Formula One was so big and it's so much fun to attend in person. Such a different experience of racing in the US. But now there's huge Formula One fans in the US, and that was not something that was there, but it came from that content, right? Of, hey, let's watch this in a different way. But you're right, it drives that to want to. Now here, a lot of it is viewing it on television because there's not as many Formula One races to attend in person at Las Vegas. I think maybe the only US one currently, but it does translate to that. You know,
I might have to edit that part out, but I think there's one in Austin that's been a very well-known race.
That's right.
And in Miami,
that's right.
Like 3 races in the United States.
You know what's funny? We should leave it in, because in the sense of, I shouldn't forget that, because one of our former students she now leads the marketing for the Formula One race in Miami, and does all the marketing for that. And so I apologize to her and apologize to the listeners for that. But you're right, there are some good ones in the US, but I think even from my own perspective, my son is 6 and he's really gotten into Cubs playoff baseball. And I remember as a kid, my dad was like, content on, like, he'd have the games on the radio in the garage, and like, oh, this would be really good to be there. And it's just a logical extension of that coming further. Shifting gears a little on that though, similar, we see this investment from the Public Investment Fund and so on. Do you see that happening more? And what I mean by that is outside entities, whether it be funds from other countries or governmental funds in other places, investing more into American sports or the sports in general.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely seems to be the case. It's a good question. And hopefully it may be a topic we'll talk about in more detail in later episodes as well. But yeah, I mean, clearly that's already happened. Sovereign wealth funds have made sports a priority, and this has happened particularly in European soccer explicitly, where they've taken large stakes. And then, soccer more broadly, there's been impacts of sovereign wealth funds. Sovereign wealth funds have there's limits to what they can do in the United States and in North American pro leagues, but obviously the rise of private equity, institutional capital, and, what people would call smart investors, for lack of a better term, and accredited investors investing in sports is definitely something that is on the rise. And that's, in the NFL, there's been several teams that have sold stakes for valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. The NFL caps it at 10%. Other leagues cap it at, you can own a certain number of teams and a certain percentage of equity. There's platforms like Arctos and Arctos Capital Markets that are trying to encourage, high net worth individuals and ultra high net worth individuals to invest in sports. So yeah, I think just the growing valuations in sports. And I think Arctos put out a really interesting piece of thought leadership to say, this is one of the questions I think you had proposed as one of the topics for this conversation, which again, I think is a topic that we're going to talk about a lot this season, is, can the rising valuations in sports franchises maintain or go up real estate is one way that they can go up because that's a whole new asset and part of sports teams that haven't been fully unlocked, at least from my perspective. But that even if you put real estate aside, there are areas of growth in the core business operations of sports teams. Arctos had an interesting column recently directly because Arctos is a company or a firm that it provides liquidity options and helps, with from private capital perspective. Historically, that has translated into for sports teams that has translated into taking minority position into sports teams. And they did because this is a question that they get a lot is like, are sports teams, franchises appreciating at the right level? And they showed through multiple different data points how that is rising at a level that you would expect given, other markets, given the fundamentals of sports and given the fundamentals of the business, that the appreciation in the enterprise value is in line with the expectations on normally, or usually accepted financial metrics. And I think that's a good article to look at, particularly as people are thinking about, and good analysis to look at as people are thinking about valuations of sports franchises. And in context of the question that you're asking, why is private equity interested? Is because the value appreciation is happening, but that the fundamentals of the sports business allow continued value appreciation to potentially happen, and making investments in assets that can appreciate in value, particularly ones that are uncorrelated with other financial markets, meaning like sports teams have consistently appreciated in value in good and bad economic times. That's something that becomes attractive to outside capital.
It's always a question that I get, whether it's from students or people that generally know what we do, is why do people want to buy sports teams if they often don't make money or they're not an enormous money making venture? And you pointed this piece, and I would argue that oftentimes they are a pretty good money making venture, depending on how you run the team and so on, and the league that you're in, the sport that you're in. But as you mentioned, the enterprise value of these franchises goes up enormously. I mean, if you just look back to when the Lakers were sold or when the Clippers were sold, the enterprise value of what was purchased when they purchased those to when they're sold, it's unbelievable. I don't know what the most recent sale, maybe the Celtics that we talked about recently, enormous growth from the value of those teams from when they're bought previously. Do you think that trajectory can continue, or is that something that will cap out? I guess you mentioned the real estate part. I think that's a really interesting part. And that's why, going back to last year when you did that work, and then we talked about it on the podcast several times, that's a really interesting aspect of it. Because if you haven't, and any of the listeners, those places like the Battery in Atlanta, or was it Titletown in Green Bay, awesome experiences, really cool places around the stadiums. And I think teams investing, or even to a certain degree, all around Wrigley, what's been done all around Wrigley. And from a team to invest in those types of things, you could really see the value growing.
Yeah, I think the first part I did want to talk about is what you talked about in terms of profitability. I think sports teams, not solely, but obviously largely due to league media rights deals, particularly major professional sports teams in North America, when those deals increase like they have in the NBA and the NFL and NHL, those deals are pretty much almost 100% profitable or 100% profit accretive, which means, the media rights, there's no necessarily, there's some, but there's limited cost increase. And while the value of those deals continues to increase, that's one of the reasons that Major League Baseball teams are interested in consolidating their rights to create a national platform to maximize the value of those rights. So I would somewhat argue against the idea that these teams aren't profitable, even though, because I think they are increasingly becoming profitable, NFL teams explicitly, but even other teams, particularly as they explore new revenue streams and have capital partners like Arctos come in to help them better understand the value of those revenue streams. At the same time, yeah, I mean, that was obviously, like I was saying, part of the reason I brought up that article that the Arctos Insights team brought up is to show how enterprise value of franchises can continue to increase. One of the things I did talk about in the white paper I co-authored, and not everything has to be about something I did in this podcast, but
No.
But in the white paper I co-authored with Clutch Sports and RBC about sports anchored mixed use developments is to say there definitely are pressures on the core revenue streams of sports organizations. So I think it is definitely a question that is worth asking, particularly if you're talking about, can media rights deals continue to increase? Can sponsorships, ticket sales, merchandise, hospitality, local, either national revenues, global revenues, or local revenues continue to increase? I think there's arguments both ways. Certainly you have to pressure test all the different revenue streams to see if those can increase and increase profitably in ways that can increase the enterprise value of of franchises. There's always going to be a premium on the fact that there's only so many of these franchises. So that obviously there's a, you know, arguably a non-economic or one non-economic way of there's a premium to be placed on a scarce asset. But, and to your point also, like part of the reason we wrote that paper or I co-authored that paper is that real estate should serve as a driver for a variety of different reasons of increased revenues, increased profitability, and increased, ability to increase enterprise franchise values. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just, again, obviously, if everybody agreed that this was always going to go up, then there wouldn't be an other side of the argument. Some of the times, the same when you talk about valuation, if everybody agreed on every valuation of every company, there wouldn't be a stock market because you can't trade a stock if somebody doesn't think it's going to go up or somebody thinks it's going to go down. Fundamentally, that's why there's a stock market that exists. So it's definitely an interesting conversation, but Arctos is a leader in this space, but certainly there are other platforms that talk about and highlight the value and the potentially increasing in values of enterprise values of sports franchises.
It is definitely something we'll talk about so much more over the course of the season. Like Adam mentioned, we'll have guests that speak to these things, not only from the enterprise value of teams, but the real estate component of it, the developments with sports at the center of those. I think it's a great topic for us to continue to explore. And it was one, again, pleasantly surprised from last year of, hey, stadium construction wasn't normally in my wheelhouse, but it's really interesting. And I think that's one of the things that's, the podcast and doing the research and getting interviews does give you the behind the scenes of that. It is a really impactful and interesting thing. In the off season, so to speak, the time that we had off from the podcast, I had the chance to attend the TED Sports Conference here in Indianapolis. And so TED, the organization that obviously many of us, the listeners would know, they have their flagship event, which they do in Vancouver. And then there are TEDx events, which are really put on by universities or other institutions that kind of use the naming. TED itself, the organizer, did this here in Indianapolis. They're planning to continue to do it, I think, in Indianapolis going forward. That said, we've obviously heard me complain about Indianapolis a lot in many ways. However, as a sports city, it is a really good one. I think that the ecosystem and the infrastructure from sports, they've done a great job with that. Actually, some of the construction pieces, the venues that are here, the value of the teams continuing to grow. But what was really interesting to me in that, the entire conference, was a couple key themes. And a big one was around women's sports, but not in the traditional way that you and I have talked about a lot. I mean, that was prevalent. I mean, Tamika Catchings was one of the speakers, and she, a four-time Olympian and WNBA Hall of Famer, all these things. And she talked about how when she started playing sports, they were men's sports retrofitted to women. There weren't specific spaces designed for women, and they're doing an initiative to create, athletic facilities that are tailored to women's sports, which I think is really, really interesting. But the other point that she made, along with the president of FIBA, was think about the marketing and the value that's there from women's sports of tapping into a whole different demographic of people, not only from the sport itself, but all of the collar content that goes around that. You think about the cottage industry of talking about the game in the NBA, the NFL, Major League Baseball. That same thing is going to continue to grow and expand with women's sports. And I think that's a really interesting part, especially because if you look now with the WNBA season, where it is coming up, collective bargaining agreement for the players. We had all the things Nafisa Collier was talking about a couple of weeks ago. And so it's a really interesting crossroads for especially the WNBA, but I think women's sports in general as a money-making venture in that route.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, one, I think it's, you're attending the TED conference has been helpful. We're going to get a couple episodes from that, and I'm looking forward to hearing the episodes that you recorded from some of the speakers and guests that you met from the TED conference. Two, I think to your point about women's sports, I think that's an ongoing conversation that we're hopefully going to explore more in this season. My company currently works with the Chicago Sky, so you're talking from a WNBA perspective and seeing some of the metrics and ways things have grown and the partnerships they've been able to put into place has been really interesting. I think to your point about, one of the things that is interesting, one of the things that my company will be helping the Sky and some other folks, other teams potentially in the WNBA and women's sports otherwise is really understanding the fans. So I think there is, one of the things that I've written about previously is like, there are a lot of male fans that follow women's sports, and that can be even the majority of fans. ESPN at one point said that 2/3 of the fans watching WNBA games were male. And I think that's where, one of the popular things, I wrote a column about this, or some of the popular misconceptions in sports and how you can use that to your advantage to understand the value and demographic. Because I do think there are, for like ways to leverage, you really understand the audiences, whether that's from a demographic, interest, consumption, geography, search, social behavioral data. There's a lot of things you can look at to really understand those audiences and be able to target those audiences. And I think the WNBA in particular has tapped into a much, both from a, wide perspective and depth perspective, is really targeting audiences. Part of I have no necessarily perspective on this, but it does look like, to your point about the WNBA and some of the comments that have been going about leadership and from the players, and if there's going to be a lockout and what's that's going to look like, and why are we at this place where the WNBA seems to be at its most successful point, but there's a lot of historical legacy, financial revenue issues that also need to be examined. So I think it's just, that's part of why we like, or at least I like, I shouldn't speak for you necessarily, but what it was actually having the podcast is exploring, like, why is the WNBA heading towards a lockout? Why are the salaries are what they are in the WNBA? How did the WNBA come to decide, potentially to do the media rights deal that it did, which is quadrupling what it used to be previously? Why are the ratings, even though they're similar with the WNBA and the NBA, didn't necessarily translate to the similar levels of value? So I think there's just a lot, at least domestically, I should say, for those ratings. I think there's a lot of interesting topics that these things that are in the news, allow us to explore and hopefully talk to guests to explore. But yeah.
Well, I think that you're right. I'm 100% with you because it allows you to go a level deeper. I think on the surface, we look at this and we think certainly they should be paid more money. It seems like they should be paid more money too, in the sense that the league is doing well. Everything's up and to the right in a lot of ways. But as you mentioned, when you peel back the layers, there's a lot of things that are involved in that. The previous CBA, the structure of ownership with the NBA and the WNBA teams and how those things work. There's a lot of nuance to it. And I think that what's really great about having the podcast is obviously doing that work on our own, but getting really interesting people to come in that have more knowledge than either of us that work on the inside of that to give us detail around why some of these things evolve and shift the way that they do. That one's going to be a fun one to watch. I would really hope there's no work stoppage for many reasons. One, the enjoyment of the content itself, but two, I do think the trajectory of it is going in the right direction. I think that, like you mentioned, the breadth of targeting the audiences, they do a great job of that. And I think a lot of sports could take cues from the WNBA, especially in that realm, because they do a great job of bringing in fans. And that's a really interesting point that you brought up, that if you think about it, it is true that there are a lot of, it's not just women that watch the WNBA. There's a lot of male fans, a lot of basketball fans, regardless of gender. I think they continue to put a quality product out there and the games be exciting, and maybe some officiating components to it. And there's big complaints about the officiating, the freedom movement, and the injuries that are there. I do think it is telling that if you look at the top of the league, some of the best players in the league injured and out for long periods of the year. Is it correlation or causation? I don't know, but it will be more enjoyable to see those marquee players be out on the floor. But I think, again, that's a topic that we're going to cover a lot over the course of the season. I mean, I think if we think about where we're going to go this year, obviously the stadiums and the values from a team's perspective. If we look at media rights and streaming, we talked about that in the WNBA. I think that's a big component. We'll talk about your area of expertise around sponsorship and fan monetization and data strategy. And then I think from my perspective, I'm really interested in yours as well. Obviously, the innovation technology, we talked about artificial intelligence in sports a little bit, but how those things continue to take hold in sports, I think are going to be big topics for this season, especially some of the guests that we already have lined up. But Adam, are there other things that you really want to get to this season or think are really pressing to get to?
Well, I do want to hold on the point you just made about innovation and technology. I wrote a column previously about the impact of video creation, video editing, and on an automated basis, and how that could unlock a lot of sports media rights value. Because if it could lower the cost or time or energy that you would need to create advertising content on media rights platforms, that is something that could make it much easier for smaller companies to advertise on larger platforms, or even larger companies, because they can more easily create the content to the advertising content that could go on to within the media rights, whether it's through broadcasts or otherwise. I'm curious to hear, obviously, given your background, if you think with Sora, the release of this Sora 2 and the success that that's had, if you see any implications of Sora on the sports industry, or if you agree with that point of view on the rise of video editing platforms in sports.
I think it makes a huge difference. I think of the manual intervention that's behind that now and the curating of that concept. I think one thing we'll have to let go of as sports fans, and probably teams and leagues as well, is the enormous granular level of control of that content itself. And what I mean by it is, think back to a conversation we had last year at the vice president content of the Bulls, how curated that content is and how it gets put out. I think we'll see a shift a little bit to, hey, we're just going to get content out to try to have people consume that. For listeners, if you haven't heard of Sora or tried Sora, check it out. It's really interesting. I think that you get that uncanny valley feeling in some ways sometimes too. But you're right. I think one of the big impacts that we'll have with the continued innovation, AI especially, is the operationalizing of a lot of workflow. So whether that's workflow in the media, whether that's workflow from a team or internal perspective, whether it's workflow around fan engagement, that's a big thing we've been talking about in my courses as of late is, yeah, there's an enormous impact in sports with player personnel or evaluation, contracts and salary caps, all those things. And they're data heavy. But bigger impacts you just see being made in fan engagement, in how to understand the fan, who's in the venue, who's watching at home, how are they consuming, when are they consuming. I think that's the bigger, or at least the more immediate impact from an artificial intelligence perspective, especially to sports, because there's so much more tangible that can be done with that.
And then what do you, because that's one area obviously that I've been focused on, but from your perspective, what do you think the implications are of the better understanding of the fan?
I think there's a couple. One, better revenue generation, because you understand a fan better, you can engage them better, you can sell to them better. That's the unsexy answer for a fan perspective. Hey, we're going to spend more money because they know us better. But if you spin that back, you want your team to understand you better and how you want to consume, right? Gone are the days of, hey, I just bought, 41 games, season tickets for the NBA. They come in the mail on a sheet, and then I just show up at the gate, right? Those experiences are going to start to be more tailored. Okay, you bought these 10 games. At these 10 games, there's these promotions. You want to do those because your kid likes this player, and this is a jersey night or is a bobblehead, whatever it may be. Much more engaging, enjoyable experience based on what you want to really engage in. But then the flip side of that is the data and the understanding that the teams and leagues and organizations get from that. And then how does that spin off, right? Whether it's with partners or whether it's with content consumption. I think that's a really interesting play for those teams and leagues, venues, whether it's around revenue generation or just creating and updating the fan experience. To know that fan better, I think will create a better value chain across the board for them all the way down to us as fans.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think exactly what you said. I think it's like the only reframe I was going to say before you went into it, which you framed correctly, is like if you have more data about the fans, whether it's from ticket sales, merchandise, hospitality, food and beverage, mixed use developments, right? If you know what people want, then you can give the people what they want, I guess, as Jalen Rose would say. But like that's the idea. Is like the sports teams, of course, are in the business of making money, and certainly their investors and their financial backers are in the interest of making money. But the idea of, leveraging data to create, somebody's talked about this, or some concepts of personalization at scale, right? If you can create personalized experiences that at the scale of tens of thousands, millions, or, potentially billions of people that consume sports content, I think that's something that would be attractive, right? Because you can get the things that what you want, when you want, how you want them. Has always been the goal of every business, not just in sports. So I think it's an interesting topic for sure.
Do you think sports, and this is a question I get often too, do a good job of that? And here's what I mean. If you look at traditional businesses or businesses, at least from a tech forward perspective, they sit on the front edge of new innovations, new technologies, and trying to use them. Sports can sometimes be seen as not an old school business, but businesses that are more risk averse in some ways, or this is how it's always been done. I mean, the argument that people always make is the Moneyball argument, right? Of, oh, well, hey, there's the gut feel versus the computers. But if you extrapolate out that to the business side, are sports organizations, in your experience, willing and want to do these things that up the fan engagement and understand the data behind it? Or is it kind of like pulling teeth to get them to do that?
I think there's two separate questions. Was there an interesting one is like, is the sports industry doing that already? I guess the political answer would be say there's a mix, but largely no. I think largely
Mm.
there's room for improvement on understanding the fan. That's something that my company in particular is trying to lead the charge on, which is aggregating multiple data sets across, first party data, which is typically the data that teams have, with other behavioral survey and third party data sets to really understand, what are people really interested in? How are they spending their time, money, energy, resources? And how does that translate to understanding and maximizing sports revenue streams? I think charitably, I'm not even saying charitably. I think I shouldn't say it charitably, but the sports industry has been built on relationships. And I think there's always going to be a place for relationships in almost any business, but particularly the sports industry has people who have been successful in sports industries as a whole has been built on relationship. And that can be a relationship with corporate partners, the relationships that teams have with their fans, the relationships that, from a media rights perspective, in terms of either long-term, short-term, or medium-term relationships that leagues have with media rights partners. But it's definitely been historically a relationship-driven business. There are other businesses that have moved and pushed the needle much more to either, particularly if we're talking about advertising and audience understanding, into a more technology, artificial intelligence, big data business. And I do think there will be a convergence of the sports industry with those larger industries, or that's one of the things that I believe in at Roar. But I think it is like, right. I mean, it's hard to do that when there's been ways of being successful that have worked historically and will probably continue to work in a lot of forms in the sports industry. So I think it's just, one of the ironies of Moneyball, I don't know if this is still the case with the A's, but when Billy Beane was in charge, they actually spent more money on scouting once they had Moneyball, because they said, the data, if you combine the best scouting with the best data, you could use that to even better identify players who could better fit the system. And, what's happened in baseball, which happens in a lot of industries, is once people understand and can use data, there's a convergence of people who, it's harder and harder to find, some form of what's called alpha, right? What can you get that's different than what, the market could find on its own? And when there's a convergence of people understanding and using similar types of models to optimize performance, it's harder to get that alpha. So leveraging qualitative data or insights there's still a place for it. It's still a big place for it, and probably will continue to be a place for it in the long term of the sports industry. But yes, I think it's always in any industry, it's, how do you balance, innovation with ways that things have been successful historically. There's a very famous paradox called the innovator's dilemma, where it's, when do you decide to disrupt your current business model because new technology is coming? There's a lot of companies right now, particularly when it comes to artificial intelligence, Google most notably, with its search business. Is its search business going to be disrupted by Perplexity? Specifically, it's focused on search, generally by artificial intelligence, particularly ChatGPT. How does Google do that? How do they balance their current search business, which some people have called the greatest business in the world, in terms of the cash flows and profitability that come with that, with artificial intelligence? There's no real clear answers. And I think, again, exploring those topics are something we're looking forward to doing this season.
Yeah, it'd be fun to explore those, especially like you said, because of all the different ways that it can go. And you're right. You and I have talked about this a lot on this podcast and our own classes, is that just like the internet was when we were much, much younger, artificial intelligence is a tool. It's a tool in the tool belt. And I think that you can use that to augment the knowledge that you have and the skills that you have. And if you can get really good at that, they're right. I think the other thing that they missed in Moneyball is there was not a whole lot of focus on Barry Zito or Mark Boulder or Tim Hudson, those guys that probably won 60 games between the third. But anyway, I digress. Still an outstanding movie.
Wins and losses are, oh yeah, updated. Yeah, so I pitch it.
It definitely is one of those things. And I think that's interesting that you bring that up, that, you would think that sports organizations are very innovative in a lot of different ways, but it is a refrain that we hear often of that they could be using some of these things better, especially around the fan engagement component of that. And I think that will definitely be a topic of the season as we go forward, because it's moving at such a pace that is continuing to shift and change. And I think sports organizations and teams and leagues will continue to try to keep up with that. Beyond that, I think there'll obviously be some college sports talk with NIL and how these things are wrapped into those components as well. But it's exciting. It's an exciting year coming up, especially because of the great guests that we have coming up. So we're really looking forward to what is the fifth season of this podcast.
I just want to before we go, just point out what you just talked about with college sports. There's a lot of
Mhm.
intersection topics we've talked about across those. There was a report recently about the Big Ten potentially getting a $2 billion investment from private equity to help facilitate the growth of the league. So the intersection of private capital in sports and college sports, and that how that potentially impacts college sports generally, but NAL specifically. There's a lot of and then the rise of technology, mixed use developments, how that impacts college sports. There's a lot of these topics that really intersect, and being able to have a good understanding of the, intersections of where these topics, converge, and really understanding and taking insights that can be applied is something, again, we have a unique perch here on the podcast to really explore.
100%. And I think you're right. It's amazing how those things all are intertwined and they trickle down not only from a professional level, but to the college and even below that. And so it'll be our remit to try to bring the through line in those through. But I'm excited for the season. I'm really excited for the guest that we have coming up and appreciate the time to do this with you again. But thank you very much for the time today. And we look forward to all the interviews and all the content coming up this season. So thank you to all the listeners and we're excited for all of this.
Yeah, really excited. It's going to be a great season. We have some really good guests, really good topics. And there's always topics that emerge. The sports industry is never a dull place. So always some fun stuff to talk about. Looking forward to it.
For sure. Thank you, everybody.